Okay, hello Cloud Gurus and welcome to this lecture. This lecture is on Web Identity Federation and Cognito. So Cognito has started coming up in the exam, and in order to understand Cognito, let's talk about Web Identity Federations. So Web Identity Federation lets you give your users access to AWS resources after they have successfully authenticated with a web-based identity provider like Amazon, Facebook, or Google. And following the successful authentication, the user receives an authentication code from the Web ID provider, which they then trade for temporary AWS security credentials. So all Web Identity Federation is when you're trying to sign into a website using your Facebook credentials or your Google credentials or your Amazon credentials, etc. And so what Amazon offer as a Web Identity Federation provider service is Amazon Cognito. So that's all it is. Amazon Cognito is a Web Identity Federation service, and it has a whole bunch of cool out-of-the-box features. So you can sign up and sign in to your apps using Cognito. You can add access for guest users. It acts as an identity broker between your application and your Web ID providers. So you don't need to write any additional code. So you don't need to go in and write the code that says sign in from Facebook or sign in from Google. Cognito handles all of this for you, and it synchronizes your user data for multiple devices. So if you go in and change your username or maybe an email address or whatever on your mobile phone, those settings and changes will be replicated out to your other devices as well. And basically, Cognito is recommended for all mobile application AWS services. So that's all that Cognito is. It's a Web Identity Federation service by Amazon. And basically, there's a recommended approach for Web Identity Federation using social media accounts like Facebook. Essentially, what you would do is, let's say we've got a website that consists of Lambda, DynamoDB, as well as S3. We've got our user and they want to use these resources. The first thing they're going to do is go and authenticate with Facebook. Facebook will then give them this authentication token, and they then essentially send this authentication token to Cognito. Cognito will respond and then grant them access to your AWS environment, depending on what level of access that you permit. And then they'll be able to do things like execute Lambda functions, store data in DynamoDB tables, or store images in S3, etc. So they'll be able to access your AWS environment. So Cognito brokers between the app and Facebook or Google to provide temporary credentials which map to an IAM role, allowing access to the required resources. And there's no need for the application to embed or store AWS credentials locally on the device, and it gives users a seamless experience across all mobile devices. Now, going into your exam, you're going to be tested on Cognito. Really, it's around the difference between Cognito user pools as well as identity pools. So we'll start with user pools. User pools are basically just for your users. They're user directories, and they're used to manage sign up and sign in functionality for mobile and web applications. So users can sign in directly to the user pool. So that means their username and password is basically stored within Cognito itself, or they could go ahead and use a third-party identity broker like Facebook, Amazon, or Google. And what Cognito is going to do is going to act as an identity broker between the identity provider and AWS. And successful authentication generates a JSON Web Token, or JWT. So if you see JWT, it just stands for JSON Web Token, and that's basically means that you've already successfully authenticated with Amazon, Google, or Facebook. Now, identity pools are enabled to provide temporary AWS credentials to access AWS services like S3 or DynamoDB. So identity pools are all about the authorization of access to AWS resources, whereas user pools are all about your actual users. So that's the difference between user pools and identity pools. User pools are things like your maybe your email address, your password, etc., etc. Whereas identity pools is the actual granting of you access to an AWS resource. So let's see all of this in action. So we've got our user, and she wants to connect into our website. Essentially what she is going to do is she's going to log in using her Facebook account. Once Facebook has authenticated her account as being genuine, so her username and password is correct, it's going to pass back a authentication token to Cognito. Cognito is then going to convert that to a JWT token. She then sends that JWT token to an identity pool, and that identity pool will then grant her AWS credentials in the form of an IAM role, and then she will be able to go on and access her AWS resources, so DynamoDB, Lambda, etc., etc. So user pools are all about usernames, passwords, that sort of thing. Identity pools is the actual granting of authentication to your AWS resources. Another cool thing about Cognito is the way it does synchronization. So it tracks the association between user identity and the various different devices that they sign in from. So if you sign in from your iPad or from your phone, it's all going to be tracked. And in order to provide a seamless user experience for your application, Cognito uses push synchronization to push updates and synchronize user data across multiple devices. Cognito uses SNS to send a notification to all the devices associated with a given user identity whenever data stored in the cloud changes. So what does this mean in action? Well, let's say we've got our user and they go in and they update their email address, or they change their password or whatever. Maybe they change a setting inside their app. What's going to happen is Cognito is going to send out a SNS silent push notification, and it would send that out to their laptop or to their phone or to their tablet, and it means all those devices would be synchronized with the new data. So onto my exam tips. Just remember what Cognito is. Federation allows users to authenticate with a web identity provider such as Google, Facebook, or Amazon. The user authenticates first with the web ID provider and then receives an authentication token. This is exchanged for temporary AWS credentials, allowing them to assume an IAM role. And Cognito is an identity broker which handles the interaction between your application and the web ID provider, and you don't need to go ahead and write your own code. Critically for the exam, what you need to remember is the difference between user pools and identity pools. So a user pool is user-based. It handles everything like user registration, authentication, account recovery, etc., etc. Whereas an identity pool actually goes in and grants you that IAM role, and allows you, basically it authorizes you access to your AWS resources. So that's the difference between the two, and you will be tested on that if you get any Cognito questions in your exam. So that is it for this lecture, everyone. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not, feel free to move on to the summary lecture. Thank you.